Last month, I polled my patrons asking for which low poly character I should make next, and to my surprise, Carmelita Fox from Sly Cooper won. Now maybe that's because it's the 20th anniversary of Sly Cooper 2, or if it has something to do with the fact that Carmelita Fox's model in the original game is, maybe not the greatest thing we've ever seen in the history of game art. But in any case, I documented over 20 hours of footage showcasing every single step in my process that I took in order to create this model completely from scratch in the Mega Man Legends inspired low poly art style I've been making my recent models and characters in. You can actually download this model right now if you are a member of my Patreon, but more on that later in the video. This is also the first time I've made a full animation in a breakdown video like this, so make sure to stick around to the end to see that as well. I hope this video is fun to watch and educational. Let's get into it. And of course, first we want to start with our turnaround drawing. And the 3D model you're seeing on the left here was created by a John Burton Darrow III, so huge shout out to them. I really love how faithful this feels to the art style often seen in the cutscenes and the cover art of these games. So I used his model as reference as I was sketching out my turnaround drawing here, and I also used another model by JC Thornton as reference. So huge shout out to both of those creators for making these 3D models. They were excellent reference, but I didn't stop there. I also referenced a lot of the official concept art for the game, as well as the cover art for the games, to make sure that I'm not just looking through the lens of fan art and I'm looking at the original source material to get an idea of what they were thinking with the original proportions, as well as the original colors. And as you might have noticed and just saw on screen, her eyes initially were really not doing it for me. It felt like they're in like the wrong art style. So I wanted to change those as soon as possible after I realized how off they felt. And as you might have noticed by looking on the left here, I actually have a lot of images that are cosplay references. So these are actual articles of clothing that people can actually wear in order to kind of take on the look of this character. And I cannot tell you how valuable that is to see where the stitching is located, what kind of articles of clothing they most closely resemble in the real world. It was really helpful when I was drawing the boots here. For example, one of the cosplay photos of Carmelita here where she's wearing jeans and you can see how the belt is, kind of wrapping around that, all the different straps on it, all the different lines in those jeans. That is so helpful, not just for 3D modeling, but also when you're creating these turnarounds and creating these colors, because you get to see where the stitching is actually going to be in a real world equivalent. And I would highly recommend, if you're doing a character design or if you're doing fan art, go look at pictures of cosplay or real articles of clothing that match your character and what they would wear for reference. It's super useful. It's like the clothing equivalent of looking at anatomy for a figure drawing. It's so useful to see what the real world equivalent of these things look like. So I'd highly recommend next time you're making a character design or a turnaround, go look at cosplay or just real articles of clothing that match your character. In any case, now I'm creating the side view turnaround here, which required me to look at a lot of references in 3D to see how these things actually line up. I've never really made characters that are anthropomorphic like this, honestly. I've made characters with tails, but not quite with the, I don't know what to call that, this jaw shape, the face shape that Carmelita has. So this was definitely a new thing for me that I had to get used to. But nevertheless, I'm now blocking out the tail shape, all the shapes of her different straps and everything. And honestly, I really didn't like my first go at making this side view. So I'm pretty sure I just lower the opacity here and just start over, using it as a base, but then trying to iterate every shape and improve it and make it better the second time around. As always with these turnaround drawings, the hardest, most difficult thing to figure out by far is the hair. Now braids, not too difficult. Ears, not too difficult. Ears are basically triangles. Braids you can think of, at least in low poly, as very basic shapes where they're just kind of cubes almost, with like one edge loop in the middle that's scaled up. But oh my god, the hair is just a nightmare, and especially when we'll get into 3D, we'll talk about that when we're actually at the 3D section, that hair proved extremely challenging. But before that, let's move right into the next step. So right off the bat here, I'm blocking this in with a very cool tone so that when I paint the rest of my colors on top of it, we'll have some contrast and some nice base value to work off of. Then I'm just cutting away at my base color so that's only present on all the little different accessories and parts of my character. I'm then copying and pasting that to the back view because I know that's going to have the exact same silhouette as my front view. Then I'm color picking from this official Carmelita Fox art and using that to put in some base colors, though honestly I'm going to change them pretty significantly from that art because that style they have is very specific, where those colors are super duper saturated, that they have in, some cutscenes in the game and on some of the cover art. It's a really amazing, beautiful style, but it's not exactly what I'm going with here. I'm doing a little bit more Mega Man Legends inspiration, so I'm kind of changing things up as I go along. I'm starting out by just putting down some base colors. So these are kind of mid-tones. They're not super bright, they're not super dark, but they're the base colors that I'm going to use for things like her jacket, her pants, her hair, her face, all that stuff, which I will then add shadows and highlights on top of. So you can think of this as a 3-tiered process. You want to first start out with those base colors, which are not very light, but they're also not very dark. And you're going to use those and put them all across your character first. Then after you're done putting those base colors down, then you want to move on to things like shadows and highlights. I've got a lot of questions about how I hand paint textures, and genuinely that is what I do. That's all I'm doing here is I'm blocking in colors. I'm using a lot of references for my colors. I'm using the references of official art oftentimes if I'm making fan art, or I'm looking at references of characters I like the look of, and sometimes I'll study them, I'll color pick from them to see what they did. But don't just take that color picking, and just use that in your own design. You want to use that as inspiration to, remix the colors in your own unique way, add your own spin to it. Don't just, copy and paste what another artist did, obviously. That's just stealing. But be creative with it, don't be afraid to look at inspiration. Don't be afraid to look at reference. Look at Pinterest, look at the official art in these games. They're often really excellent sources of reference. It's always fun shading metals and really trying to push the highlights and shadows in those areas, because in order to sell something as being metallic, I think the easiest way to do that is to just have a huge range of contrast in your values, which basically means you have really bright, like pin sharp highlights contrasted against extremely dark shadows. Really want to sell something as being metallic, make sure you have a lot of contrast there when it comes to your lights and darks, because that will really sell things as being metallic. The same way you can sell hair as being hair by having that like anisotropic highlight, but you also want to have material contrast, which, that there could be a whole video I do about that. But essentially, you want all the different parts of your character to be shaded in different ways depending on what material type they are. It does depend on your art style, but if you have cloth and you have something metallic on the front of it, in art styles like this, you generally want to really exaggerate how metallic something is versus, how like cloth something is, make it feel like an exaggerated version of how that would look in reality in order to really sell these characters and make them as appealing as you possibly can. In order to create her 3D model in Blender, I'm spawning in a basic human meta rig, which is part of the Rigify add-on. Then I'm importing in my turnaround drawing I just finished shading in Photoshop using the image as plane option. From there, I'm cutting up my turnaround into a front view, a side view, and a back view, and I'm lining them up around my skeleton so that I have a box shape around my skeleton that I can use as reference to make this 3D model around. And from there, I'm just spawning in cubes and shaping them to the shape of all the different objects I have on Carmelita here. So her boots, her hands, her coat, all that stuff, I am just lining up my cubes, all the different vertices on them, with the shape of all the different parts of Carmelita here that I have in my turnarounds. Next up, I imported the full underscore face part I have in my low poly parts pack, and if you don't know what that is, I recently added a low poly parts pack to the premium Gumroad version of my low poly course, and you can check that out, link in the description below. That's the premium version of the low poly course on Gumroad. But in any case, there's a whole lot of parts in there that I included so that I and anyone else who downloads the pack can use them as a base to edit from there. And I was really surprised because I was able to import this face and edit it super quickly, and it actually worked really well for this model, which I was actually not expecting. I thought I'd have to make my own face from scratch, but that was definitely not the case, and it saved me a bunch of time, which is why I have them in that pack to begin with. So if you're interested in saving time in your low poly character creation process, the Gumroad version of this course is linked in the description below. My first attempt at recreating the hair here in 3D did not go well. I essentially just matched the silhouette of my front view using a bunch of planes, and it just did not make sense in 3D. It looked fine from the front view, but the moment you tried to make it look 3D, everything just fell apart, and I ended up needing to do so much work in order to actually get this hair working in 3D. I tried to import other hair models I've used on other models, but I just could not remix it in a way that actually looked like Carmelita's hair. So I ended up needing to, on my third try, completely restart from scratch and try to recreate her hair the best I possibly could in 3D using my own approach, and it was extremely difficult. There were so many headaches in trying to get it to look the way I wanted it to, because this low poly style, it's really hard to recreate hair that is, you know, a little bit more wavy, a little bit more complicated and busy, kind of like Carmelita's is. And I had a lot of difficulties trying to make it look good. I really hope by watching these time lapses, people don't get the impression that this stuff is easy. It's absolutely not. Always remember that with social media, you're only seeing the end product. You're never seeing the blood, sweat, tears, and all the hard work and pain that goes into these things. You're only ever seeing the final product. The thing that ultimately saved me though, and let me actually create this hair in the end, was looking at reference. I cannot tell you how helpful these two models were to look at, and looking at the official Carmelita model, just looking at their topology, looking at turnarounds of them in 3D, and really trying to study how they were actually constructed, both officially and in fan art, is just so incredibly helpful. You can't just look at 2D references when you're making hair, I don't feel. You really need to be looking at 3D references to really wrap your head around how these things are typically constructed. And it helped me so much. So again, for those struggling with hair, always remember to keep looking at references. Go to the models resource, go wherever you need to go in order to find reference, because it's so helpful when you're modeling hair. I also definitely struggled with trying to get the topology on the coat to make sense. And once again, going back to reference, seeing how other people constructed this in 3D, seeing how they officially did it at the actual Carmelita Fox model is so helpful. I cannot overemphasize how helpful it is looking at topology, looking at 3D reference when you're making 3D models in order to figure out how these things are actually constructed. It saves you so much time, and you're going to get so much higher quality and better of a final product. Modeling her gun here was a ton of fun though. It's just such a chunky, fun shape. It's so big and loud. I really loved modeling this, and it was not too difficult, especially after dealing with that hair. It was like the easiest thing to model in the universe, my goodness. The same with the tail here. It was mostly pretty self-explanatory stuff, but a lot of fun to model nonetheless. I need to give a huge shout out to Dr. Lot, who in my last video recommended an auto reloader plugin, as well as saving my textures as PSDs rather than PNGs. And oh my gosh, did this save me so much time and really speed up my iteration process. So huge shout out to Dr. Lot for recommending me this. I couldn't actually get the auto reloader plugin to work, but just being able to press Ctrl S to save a PSD, then go to Blender and press Alt R to reload and instantly have those files updated rather than needing to go to File, Export, Export as, PNG, overwrite the PNG, then reload in Blender. It's just such a huge time save when all you need to do is press Ctrl+S, then reload the texture in Blender in order to see the updated result. Outside of that though, this was a pretty standard stuff. I'm once again starting by chopping up different pieces of my turnaround and drawing on top of them in order to create a UV map. And I'm a weirdo who doesn't make a UV map first and then makes the texture. I tend to make the texture, then put it into Blender and kind of just do my UVs from there, which can be kind of tedious, but for whatever reason, that's just what makes the most sense to me. I'm going to my turnaround drawing, chopping off different pieces of it, seeing how they look in 3D, editing from there, getting more pieces from my turnaround, putting them in my texture map, going to 3D, applying my UVs, seeing how they look, going back to Photoshop, saving my PSD over and over again, and that's kind of what my workflow actually looks like. So if you're using Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop or a similar application like that, I'd highly recommend when you're painting your texture to save them as a PSD, then just drag and drop them into Blender, because you can use a PSD in Blender the exact same way you can use any other image file type in Blender, which is super awesome. Once again, I'm mostly using Project from View here, and I have my final turnaround drawing at the bottom right of Blender here in order that I can reference it and make sure that my 3D model is as accurate to my reference drawing as it possibly can be. It's also very important that I keep in mind what on Carmelita here is symmetrical versus what is asymmetrical. For example, her face texture is asymmetrical because it has things like the hair shadow on her face that cast a non-symmetrical shadow kind of on her forehead area. However, there are other parts of her, like her waist, that are symmetrical, where you have that belt wrapping around, and that is perfectly symmetrical, meaning that we only need to draw and have half of that on our UV map, because in Blender, all we need to do is make sure that that part of the model is mirrored while we're doing our UVs, and it'll automatically get applied to the other side and mirrored to the other side perfectly. So not only is that going to save us time when we're doing our UVs, but that's also saving us very precious UV space, because at the end of the day, on our texture map here, we have a limited amount of space to work with. So every single thing on our model that can be symmetrical, we want to chop off half of it and only do half of it in our texture map here, so that we're saving as much space on our UV map as possible, so that we can cram as much detail and as high of quality as possible into our model that we possibly can. That's why I have half of things like her jeans here on the texture map, whereas for her face and her chest, I'll have the entire thing on the UV map here, and it's not just half of it, because I know that the chest and the face are asymmetrical, whereas the jeans are symmetrical. And while this part of the process I would not describe as particularly challenging, it is extremely time consuming. This is the most time consuming part of the entire model creation process. So it's important to get all these details right, to not get frustrated, and really be patient and take your time in order to polish things up, make them as high quality as they possibly can look. And I'm often going under different pieces of geometry to add things like the illusion of shadows by using those darker, more saturated shadow colors from different parts of my texture map, and just using that on different faces of my model to emulate the look of very sharp shadows, which I really like. That brings me to today's sponsor, Skillshare. I've been wanting to get better at the fundamentals of drawing this fall, and with the classes and learning paths on Skillshare, it has been really easy to get started and learn. If you don't already know, Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives and has thousands of classes led by industry experts in illustration, film, design, and more. Skillshare can help you grow and take your career, hobbies, or passions to the next level. There are lots of classes on Skillshare, from designing a 3D video game in Unreal Engine, to becoming a freelance illustrator, or even learning Photoshop by a certified Adobe instructor. However, as someone who makes a lot of 3D models, especially character models, I'm always looking to improve my ability to draw. That's because as I continue to improve my ability to draw, sketch, draw gestures, find my line quality, that's all going to translate not only to the handcrafted textures I have on my models, but as I improve my drawing ability, so too does my ability to design anything improve, including characters. That's why I've been taking Gabriel Piccolo's class on character illustration, where he talks all about drawing faces, figures, and clothing. Plus, I really like how Skillshare has a learn by doing approach to teaching, where members can create and share the project they made through their class after completing it and get feedback from the community. Plus, Skillshare's new Learning Paths feature makes it easy to become an expert on a skill from the ground up, because Learning Paths are curated sequential class collections to master a specific skill or competency. The first 500 people to use my link in the description of this video below will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so make sure to click that link below to get started today. So for this model, I wanted to do something a little bit different, and inspired by the Hyperdimension Neptunia models I've made so many animations with in the past, I ended up making her face texture transparent, meaning that all of the eye in her face is essentially all transparent pixels, and everything behind that is just the interior of that model. And from the interior of that model, I modeled what is essentially the inside of a sphere that I textured to be white with a gradient of a dark blue beneath it to give the impression of some cast shadows coming from her top lid. From that, I then actually modeled her pupils. Her pupils are literally 4 verts on a plane, but because that texture is transparent, it looks like it's a much more detailed model than it actually is. This approach has a lot of advantages, namely we don't have to add a bunch of topology for her eyes to do things like blinks, and most importantly of all, this is going to be my first ever low poly model where you can pose the eyes around, which just adds such an extreme layer of expressiveness that I just love. I was actually very pleasantly surprised with how this turned out. Even though this is my first go around of trying this technique, I'm definitely going to be exploring this in the future because this turned out super fun. Now we move on to rigging. So I'm using that basic human meta rig I spawned in and lining it up with all the different features and bones on my model to the best of my ability. Then I'm generating my rig, applying it to my model, and posing it around to see if everything's working the way it should. Things are lining up, adding topology where needed for bends, for things in like the legs and the elbows and the tail, making sure that all makes sense. Then I had to do the extraordinarily painstaking task of making bones for all of her accessories and all of her hair. And let me tell you, this was an excruciating, long, boring, Pretty frustrating process, if I'm being honest. I ended up making 2 new bone groups to do this, one for all of her hair, the other for all of her accessories. So all of her hair, that's going to be the things like her ponytail, all the head, her bangs and stuff like that, all the hair attached to her head. And the accessories were things like her tail, the handcuffs, the bag on her belt, her ears, her collar, her zipper, etc. That doesn't sound too bad, but the amount of time it took to rig each individual little bone, especially on the hair where you had to like symmetrize everything and name things, it's just such a pain in the butt. Blender does not have fantastic rigging tools. It's one of the weakest areas of the program in my opinion, and it's just so annoying to do this. But you know what? Eventually we got through it. And having all these options available to me when I was actually making an animation proved extremely useful. Even though it was very frustrating, it was ultimately a good use of time. And being able to symmetrize those bones for the hair, as well as use the gradient tool on the tail rig, ended up saving me a lot of time as well. So here I'm going into Photoshop and making all the different facial expressions that I want on Carmelita here on her face texture, because the texture you saw we were creating earlier, that's actually ended up being her body texture. So it only had different parts of her body and hair that we wanted textured on it. But this texture is a totally separate 1K texture where it's just gonna have our facial expressions, our iris, and all that stuff dedicated to her face. It's just gonna be in this texture so that we can swap between them on our UV map and have a rig control on our rig that lets us switch between them. I have a tutorial on how to do that on my channel if you're interested. Rigging her eyes was surprisingly easy. That all I needed to do there was make 2 bones kind of located by her eyes, line them up and set up the bone roll to be correct so that when you move them, it's not going to just completely clip out of her head, and make sure that their parent is the head bone. That's another thing you're doing a lot when you're setting up all these accessory bones. That's very painstaking, is making absolutely sure the parent for all these bones is what they should be. For example, I rigged up her jacket here and all the parents on those bones had to be, I believe, spine 3, maybe spine 4 or spine 2, I don't remember, it's one of those. You have to do that for everything. So for the collar, you better make sure that's the neck bone. For the hair bones, better make sure that's the head bone. For the bag she has on her hip, you better make sure that's the hip bone. You have to do that for, it's very annoying. And you can even see I'm just like playing around towards the end of this time lapse and just having so much fun messing with these expressions. But yeah, here I am just refining and finishing up my textures in Photoshop, making them as polished as I can make them. And earlier you might have seen that I actually made a blend shape that gets rid of that geometry that I have to represent her eyelash, so that when she blinks and does other expressions, that geometry is hiding on the inside of her head seamlessly. I started this process by throwing together a poster really quick, so I wanted to do like a cool pose of her holding her gun, kind of probably facing the camera, something dynamic with a lot of foreshortening. But honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of how this turned out, and after a while, I ended up switching over to the idea of making a walk cycle, one with her holding her pistol, kind of like sleuthing around. I've made an animation very similar to this in Unreal. I actually filmed my own reference for this animation of me walking on a treadmill, holding a not real gun, but this time around I was able to take that same reference and import it into Blender. Ended up being super useful. I had to speed it up a little bit. There's a lot of things that come into making a good walk cycle animation. I would highly recommend this video by Alessandro Camparota that talks all about making walk cycles. This is like the only video you'll ever need to watch on walk cycles. It's absolutely amazing. You want the rotation of the torso to kind of oppose the rotation of the hips, and you want the hips to rotate in a very specific way. You want the up and down of the hips to make sense. You want to keep in mind the contact, the passing position. All these key poses are what you want to start out with. And from those key poses, you just refine your arcs, make sure the knees make sense, make sure the arc of the knees makes sense. And I could have polished this animation a lot more even, but you know, I have a deadline I have to get to here. Things you want to add: overlap with the shoulders. You want to have up and down on the upper torso. You want to have up and down on the head. You want to add a little bit of squash and stretch on the head. You want to animate all the hair, animate the tail as I did here, animate all the little loose bits on your character. I wanted to animate absolutely everything. I painstakingly rigged because not only for that, but when you make an animation like this, after you've made a rig, it forces you to think in the way an animator would. And when you do this, it opens up so many issues with your rig that you have to fix. For example, there's a lot of clipping issues I ran into as I was doing this walk animation, and other little things that I ended up fixing and improving on the rig as I was making this animation. So I think it's an excellent way to make sure your rig is highly polished and, you know, animation ready, is to just make an animation with your rig. I think it's something super valuable, and it'll make sure that it will be ready for other people to use your rig if you're planning on releasing it to the public, as I am here. Because this rig is available on my Patreon right now. If you join my Patreon as a member, you will get access to this rig. And in order to support my mission to provide free education to you all on this channel, it would help me tremendously if you join my Patreon as a member, because not only are you going to get access to this rig, but you'll also get your name in the credits of my videos and much more. So go check out that link in the description below to my Patreon to go download this rig and see all the other benefits my Patreon offers, including our private Discord community, which is super awesome and growing all the time. And you'll be helping me tremendously in my ability to continue to create high quality videos just like this one. But yeah, without further ado, let's see what the final animation and model ended up looking like. By the way, if you have any characters in the low poly style you'd like to see me create next, make sure to comment them right below. I love hearing from you. I might even include them in my next Patreon poll. But in any case, make sure to check out my full character modeling playlist on YouTube if you want a breakdown of how to make your own characters in this style using Blender. But if you want to jumpstart your journey into making low poly characters, make sure to check out the Gumroad version of that series, because it has a bunch of bonuses that are greatly going to speed up your character creation process. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Stupidest joke I've ever made in a video.